Despite the band Saving Abel's debut record coming out in 2008, the group's origins dated back to 2004 in Corinth, Mississippi, whose population is around 14,000. The origin of the band would begin with frontman Jared Weeks and guitarist Jason Null. Both guys had been part of the local music scene before coming together. Weeks would tell the Times-Tribune from Scranton, "We met at my friend's house. It was kind of like a date. We just got together and wrote songs for a good 3 years before recording." Null was playing in a band at the time called Sing Bay, and they'd been at that friend's house with a bunch of other people jamming from the local music scene. It would turn out also that Weeks was a big fan of the group Sing Bay. Null's foray into music only happened because of his older brother. Null used to sneak into his brother's room and steal his guitar to bang on, until one day he came home to ride his bike, only to find out his older brother had traded it in for a second guitar. He would end up giving the guitar to Jason. Jason's older brother would teach him Johnny Be Good, and he was so impressed by how quickly Jason picked up the song, he went to nearly a dozen neighbors' homes and knocked on the door and got Jason to play the tune. Null's influences would include bluegrass, country, grunge, as well as metal, while Weeks is a fan of blues and southern rock. Weeks would grow up around music, with his mother being a choir director, his father played the mandolin and banjo, his grandmother played piano, and his uncle would play drums. Weeks' first instrument was in fact drums, picking it up around age 10 or 11. He'd eventually move over to guitar thanks to a high school friend of his who taught him some basic chords. The first song he'd learn would be Leonard Skinner's Freebird. He would tell the Daily Oklahoman that a huge influence on him growing up was also the Mississippi band Three Doors Down, who he wanted to be successful like someday. The pair began writing songs on acoustic guitar together on Weeks' back porch. The pair played as a duo called Shade of Grace, doing a 50-50 split of Christian music and, as they dubbed it, romantic songs. The pair would play a bunch of shows around their hometown at places like Alley Galley and in nearby college town Starkville. They typically do some cover songs at those shows and throw in 8 or 9 originals. Then they started to do shows in Memphis, playing gigs at places like Newbies and the New Daisies, and their shows slowly started to get more recognition. Null would reach out to producer Skidd Mills, who owned a studio in Memphis, and Mills had previously worked with a lot of Christian groups, but the producer, much to their surprise, suggested the pair take a more mainstream approach in their career instead of trying to make it in the Christian rock market. He would make that comment after listening to their song 18 Days. They would start looking back at a few songs they had written several years prior, including the tune Addicted. Mills would invite the band to his recording studio in Memphis and soon sign the duo to a production deal. The idea behind the production deal was to form a band around the pair, and Weeks would tell the South Bend Tribune, "We started recruiting band members like Blake Dixon, our drummer. I graduated high school with him. Eric Taylor, our bassist, I went to church with him ever since I was in the 2nd grade. They also recruited a second guitarist in Scott Bartlett, the only member who wasn't from Mississippi. Instead, he hailed from Memphis. Bartlett was actually a studio musician at the time, initially hired to come in and lay down some tracks on their first independent release. Weeks would tell an interviewer, "We gave him the opportunity to lay down the lead tracks or join the band. He ended up joining the band." They would also soon change their name to Saving Abel, taking their name from, of course, the biblical story Cain and Abel. Null would recall in several interviews coming up with the name after doing a late-night internet search of Cain and Abel and seeing the line, "There was no saving Abel from his brother Cain." They would be adamant in interviews that they were not a Christian band. Then in 2006, Saving Abel would record an independently self-titled record. Some press publications referred to it as an EP, but I want to say it contains about a dozen tracks. The band had written a new song called Addicted, which Weeks came up with while he was working at a local hospital of Magnolia Regional Health Clinic as a phlebotomist drawing blood from patients. It was during one morning at 4 a.m. as he walked through the halls of the empty hospital, he came up with the chorus for the song. It was stuck in his head for 3 weeks before he wrote it down or even came up with the music. Not having a notepad to write down the lyrics, he'd find a doctor's prescription pad instead and wrote the lyrics on that. Weeks would pen the song about his on-again, off-again high school sweetheart. Null, during this period, was working as a manager at Kmart. The band would put the song Addicted on their MySpace page, and it eventually found its way to major record labels. The band were playing a show in Jackson, Tennessee, but that night the air conditioner broke in the venue, and the band had to continue playing through the stifling heat, struggling to stay focused. They thought they had blown their chance at signing a record deal. But after the show, A representative from Virgin Records would approach the group. They would sign a deal with the label the next day. But I do want to point out in a separate interview, Weeks would tell an interviewer that the band was initially signed to Capitol Records, and at one point they were referred to as Saving Abel by the company. But they soon got transferred to a few other record labels before landing on Virgin's roster. Virgin would push the band to tour some more to get more experience and develop their chemistry. Weeks would later admit the band would sign a terrible record deal comparing record labels to a big bank with a ton of resources. Null, meanwhile, would tell the Lansing State Journal, if you go back and listen to our initial indie release, we sounded more like Matchbox 20 meets the Wallflowers band. Really poppy. Null would add that Addicted would shape the band's sound on their major label debut. Their debut record would consist of mostly new tunes since their independent release, but they also included a few favorites from that EP, including 18 Days, Running From You, and Drowning Face Down. Released in March of 2008, the group's self-titled major label debut made waves almost immediately thanks to the lead single Addicted. It would take over the airwaves and would end up peaking at number 2 on the mainstream rock chart and crossed over to the top 40 chart, peaking at number 7, but also peaking at number 20 on the Hot 100. The risque video for Addicted would have the uncensored version debut on Playboy's website, and the song, of course, would also have to be edited for radio due to its subject matter. But the band seemed okay with that, admitting they deferred those decisions to their label. Addicted would end up being one of the most played songs on active rock radio for all of 2008. The other single from their debut record would be 18 Days, which was dedicated to the US military personnel who were fighting overseas. The video would actually be inspired by a fan-made video somebody posted to their MySpace page, and the band would end up filming the music video on an aircraft carrier close to San Francisco. The song would peak at number 6 on the mainstream rock tracks chart. The band would release a third single, Drowning. The video would see the group collaborate with NASCAR and driver Jeremy Mayfield. The group's debut record would go on to sell over 1 million copies in America. Despite their success, they also saw a ton of comparisons to other groups who were popular at the time. One interview with Gene Triplett from the Daily Oklahoman mistook the single Addicted for a Hinder song, and it wasn't something the band hadn't heard before. The band would in fact tour with Hinder, and Weeks would tell the paper, the first time someone hears this, they go, "I know that band." Weeks would add that the band's sound was so accessible and comfortable that people naturally think they've heard it before. Saving Abel would also see a ton of comparisons to Nickelback, Theory of a Dead Man, Shinedown, and of course 3 Doors Down. But the band didn't really take offense at such comparisons, with Null telling an interviewer, "These guys sell records, and in this day and time, that's an accomplishment in itself. You go to a Nickelback concert or 3 Doors Down concert or a Shinedown concert, and those guys are selling seats." The summer of 2008 would see the group tour with the likes of Shinedown and Buckcherry. They would also tour with a newly reunited Stone Temple Pilots, Korn, Puddle of Mudd, Avenged Sevenfold, Nickelback, and Chevelle. They would even get the chance of a lifetime opening for Aerosmith in the summer of 2009. They would also find some unexpected fans online, with Weeks telling an interviewer, "I've seen YouTube videos where parents have recorded their little kids singing the song Addicted. Me being from the Bible Belt, my mom would have never let me do stuff like that." By the end of their tour for their first album, the band was already road testing songs that would appear on their follow-up record, including Hell of a Ride, Bloody Sunday, and Tap Out, which Dixon said represented the heavier and raunchier side of the material. Saving Abel would return in 2010 with the record Miss America, whose title was a salute to American soldiers. It would end up debuting at number 24 on the charts, giving the band their best performing album of their career. The album would produce a slew of hits, including the title track, Stupid Girl, and The Sex Is Good, which topped the mainstream rock tracks chart. To support their second record, in addition to playing for the public, they also did shows for the US military, performing at Guantanamo Bay, Kuwait, and Afghanistan. Saving Abel would return in 2012 after taking about 6 months off and switching record labels after Virgin dropped the band. They would end up signing with Sony-owned E1. Their third record would see them compile about 30 to 40 songs, and they would end up using banjos, mandolins, and jaw harps. They would release their third record, Bringing Down the Giant, in July of 2012. The title track's video would contain an anti-bullying message, which would actually be shot at Weeks' old high school, Alcorn Central High. They would invite students and families from the area to participate in the video. The album would peak at number 74 on the charts, and the band would soon part ways with E1, with Weeks telling an interviewer in late 2013, "The last album we had, our label didn't even promote it. A lot of the people didn't even know we had a third album. Then by the end of the year, Weeks announced he was leaving the band to focus on a solo career. But he would reveal years later that his life was in turmoil since the Nickelback tour in 2009, admitting he had to leave because of his mental health and substance abuse issues. He would admit that he got hooked on OxyContin and he would end up resettling in Nashville, but his solo career didn't take off like he hoped. And when he got off pills, he was now dealing with depression and self-medicating with alcohol. His wife would finally step in and he checked himself into rehab. Meanwhile, his old bandmates would enlist a new singer from the band Trash the Brand, Scotty Austin, who just happened to share the same management as Saving Abel. Trash the Brand also opened for Saving Abel, and he was a huge fan of the group. The band had already gone through a number of lineup changes by this point in time, and they would release their latest LP in 2014, Bloodstained Revolution. The band would continue to tour while undergoing some more lineup changes. In 2021, Weeks would end up returning to the group. It would result in the Shade of Grey's 20-year songs coming out in 2021. Last year, Saving Abel would release 2 new songs with Baptize Me in Fire, with Fire peaking at number 36 on the charts. There would be some conflicting information this year, with it being initially reported that Weeks had once again parted ways with the group, only for them to put out a statement saying he was back fronting the band and would be playing their gigs scheduled for late June in Alabama. That does it for today's video, guys. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you again in Rock Culture Stories. Take care.